I've already cleared it with your other teachers too, so you're good to go.
Who else is going?
Probably Mrs. Latham and me.
We're chaperones.
Evan's like, this year sucks.
They're always there.
We're gonna stay out of the way. All we're there is just to make sure that
No one's gonna jerk.
we're not even paid for. Like, Ms. Latham and I haven't, like, we're not doing anything. You guys are, so
You just get to watch.
we're just watching and making sure you're not being fools.
This is so awesome. Thank you so much.
You bet.
I'm excited.
All right, so we're talking about the Middle Kingdom now. This is our third class, Middle Kingdom. The next class we're doing is the New Kingdom. If you remember, art in the Old Kingdom was state mandated, meaning that there were very specific rules, regulations as for how art was to be done. It was the nobility that commissioned the piece. It was the nobility that determined what the style was. Different artists might have had their own opinions as to how to do things, but didn't matter. The king said it, it was done. So we have this collapse of the Old Kingdom, and this is what I showed you in one of these slides last time where there was these intermediate periods. We're going to take a minute to look at this first intermediate period because it is kind of important in terms of what happened in the Middle Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom collapsed. Basically, we have this intermediate period of about 1,400 years, right? No, math. 140 years, sorry.
It's a little different.
Yeah, 140 years where there's this gap between. And if you can see, there's a lot of dynasties between them, right? So the first kingdom, it was 3,100 to 2,100, and there were only 6 dynasties. 3,100 to 2,100 BC. 1,000 years has 6 dynasties. Between 140 years, we have 5 dynasties. Okay? There's a lot of unrest. There's a lot of things happening. So what happened? During this period, there are lots of little fiefdoms, meaning these lots of little independent, kind of semi-autonomous areas. These were called nomes. So these areas, think of it as like a regional capital. That was called a nome. And the leaders were called nomarchs. Okay, so the central government at Memphis collapsed. Finances were drained by these huge building projects, the pyramids, the Sphinx, all that kind of stuff. They basically went into a depression, a Great Depression, so to speak. So that brought about this first intermediate period. Who were the rulers? It was mainly local governors, but also it was mortuary priests. Remember, the priests were very, very powerful. So it was local governors, but also these mortuary priests, these priests of the dead who were doing all these rituals and artworks for the dead that we saw in our last period. So Memphis is basically the capital of Egypt during the Old Kingdom that we already saw. Cairo, that's modern-day Cairo today. But during this intermediate period, we have the growth of all of these, in the white dots, all of these smaller nomes. And these were settlements and cities that existed before, but they weren't really that important. The 2 main important cities in Egypt in the Old Kingdom were Memphis and Thebes. As we move through the first intermediate period, Thebes is going to start to get more and more important. Right? We have these temples of Luxor and Karnak that we're going to see more in the New Kingdom. So there's kind of this stress between these 2 areas. Heracleopolis, which is a Greek name. I don't know why it's a Greek name. There must have been an Egyptian name, but whatever. Heracleopolis. This was also hugely important at the time. So we have all these kind of different independent cities and nomes that they're not really fighting for control. They're pretty much content to just be on their own. You have lost this centralized, important power from Memphis. And so these individual nomes are just going, cool, we just do our own thing. Like I said, the priests were very popular as well. That's just a depiction of some of these mortuary priests. Yeah?
Sorry, what were gnomes again?
Gnomes were these cities, these like capitals of these little cities, these towns. Mm-hmm. So during this period, there's no big building projects. There's no big centralized government to really take control of all this stuff. There is a huge lack of historical records. If we go back, we kind of know this. We kind of know these dates, but there's a lot that's missing. The really extensive record keeping that existed in the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, a lot of it's missing. We just don't know. There's no big centralized government. So there was a lot going on. Some scholars will say, well, this threw Egypt into this period of chaos and confusion, really only because we don't have a lot of history. But in terms of art, it was actually kind of a renaissance of art in Egypt at the time. We have this new development of what's called Shabti dolls. Now, Shabti dolls are sort of similar to the Kas statues, sort of similar to the reserve heads that we already looked at, but they have a slightly different purpose. Now, as I was researching this again, and this is the third time I've taught this class, and I didn't catch this, and I'm an idiot, because I was reading through this, and they were talking about how it was very much a common practice in Egyptian culture that if someone asked for your help, you would give it. And even much more so, it was a common practice in Egyptian culture that if the state needed your help, you would go and give it. It was seen as like a patriotic duty, sort of like volunteering for war in our culture today. And as I'm reading through this article, this book about it, they're saying, and this is how, they're just kind of offhandedly saying it, and this is how the pyramids were built too. All these citizens were offering their time, and I went, wait, slaves? And I kept reading, and they're like, yeah, it's a misconception that the pyramids were built by slaves. Certainly some slaves were used, but the majority of the work was very much skilled labor. I had no idea. So I'm sorry, I taught you something wrong when we were talking about the Old Kingdom. But I will always tell you if I find out that I'm wrong. Yes, there were slaves that were used for a lot of the grunt work and the pulling and all that stuff, but for the skilled labor, it was actually normal Egyptian citizens who volunteered their time and who saw it as a patriotic and great thing. And so for a time, it was actually, I'm just reading this last night and I'm going, this is crazy. For a time, it was seen as, again, kind of a conscriptive thing, not conscriptive, that means you have to do it. It was seen as, every person would go and volunteer a year or two or three to help the government, to build pyramids or sphinxes, or to do whatever, or to work on healing, or to help with the priests, or whatever. I had no idea. I'm not an Egyptian scholar. Sorry. Didn't know that. Anyway, so that was a bit of a follow-up on that. But that has to do with the Shabti dolls. There was this culture in Egypt that if someone asked you to do something, you would do it. Okay? If someone asked you for help, you would go and you would volunteer. Now, let's say that you're busy with something else. Your neighbor asks you to go and plow a field, for instance. But what if you're already plowing your field? Well, you can ask someone to go and take your place. But you can only do that once with that neighbor. So let's say, Maria, you got a field, and you asked me to come help you plow it. And I say, I can't, I'm in the middle of plowing my field, but Evan can go and he can help you. But the next time you ask me to do something, I gotta do it. That was their culture. Oh, okay. I can only sub for you, or I can have a sub for myself only once with you. That's it.
That's weird.
That was their culture. Otherwise, you weren't seen as a good friend or patriotic or a citizen or something like that. I'm probably way simplifying this, but all right, so what does that all have to do with these? You had to work in this life, according to the Egyptians, and you had to work in the afterlife, according to the Egyptians. So when you died, your soul was often called to go work for Osiris in the underworld. Yeah?
Would you be doing the same work, like if you were a, I don't know, what was one of the jobs they had?
Farming?
Yeah, if you were a farmer, would you have to do farming in the afterlife?
Don't know, probably. Seems to make sense. But the afterlife is supposed to be your time of relaxation and joy and afterlife and all that stuff. So what do you do when Osiris asks you to do some work in the afterlife when you're supposed to be relaxing? You bring him a Shabti doll. So when you died, you had these collection of these dolls made, And each one of the dolls was a little bit different, and it had a little bit something different purpose. So one was a farmer, one was, I don't know, a blacksmith, I don't know, right? They all perform different tasks. And so if you would buy these or have them made for you, and then you would be buried with them. That way, when you're asked to do something in the afterlife, you go, here you go. And since that doll's going to be doing it now forever and ever and ever in the afterlife, you don't need to worry because you fulfilled your duty. So
you have a doll for every purpose?
basically. And so you would be buried in a coffin, and then there would be a tiny little coffin for all your Shopti dolls along with you as well.
That is so cute. Stop.
That is messed up.
Yep.
I wish.
So they're like really small.
Yeah, they're like that big.
Were they like expensive so a lot of people couldn't afford them?
They were, some of them were very, so, some of these are wooden, right? Sometimes they were in little coffins of themselves.
That's so weird.
Just a little Shopti doll. So, all right, so a couple things here. Obviously, the more wealthy, so these are not for pharaohs. These are not for important people. This is for the middle class. This is for the middle/upper class. This is for the first time we see art being produced for the middle class. And why is this happening in the Middle Kingdom? Because there's more economy. You have all these different areas, all these different cities, these nomes, and they're flourishing without the need for a central government to drain all their money for taxes to build these sphinxes and pyramids and all this stuff. You have a period of prosperity. Yeah, it was a bit chaotic in terms of central government during the intermediate period, but it was a period of some great wealth and a lot of innovation. And so we see this artistic innovation too.
Do all the three periods, do they all have like old, new, and middle? Do they all have these Shabi?
So once these are produced, then they start to carry over and they start to continue. Mm-hmm.
So these are just for the middle class too.
Yeah. So if you were very poor, maybe you would have one Shopti doll you could take with you, right? You'd have one made for yourself, or maybe you could make it yourself, right?
So who would make them?
So there would be craftsmen who would do it. And so they started to set up these little shops where you could buy them. And so we have, for the first time in history, mass-produced art made to be sold. This is kind of the first time this has happened.
How do you know which one's like a blacksmith or like a wood carver or like a farmer?
Don't know. I'm sure they could tell.
Yeah, it looks like there's the hieroglyph.
Also, we have what's called amulets. These are these necklaces, and we start to see this development of this really, really intricate beadwork, and also really intricate gold and copper work, right? So instead of just discs of metal, you're starting to see these, thin strands of metal that are being used all throughout. So what is an amulet? An amulet is not just a necklace. An amulet has some sort of significance, religious, magical properties. Yes.
Exactly, I was about to say that.
So this is actually from the New Kingdom, but this is an example of an amulet. It's a scarab beetle, and it's made of stone, and then it's encased in this gold covering. Yeah.
What is the chain made out of? What is that?
This would be gold of some sort.
How did they attach it?
It's very intricate.
So deep.
This was for royalty. So this was a royal one. I'm just showing you an example of different sorts. Amulets are also very high class. Some middle class people would be able to buy them, but not much. Coffins start to be decorated as well during this time. So instead of just being buried in a shroud, you start to have people being buried in coffins. And then also ceramics start to develop. They're not nearly as good as what we're going to see later. But you start to see, again, the ceramics are surviving. So that means that they're built well. So this was built 4,000 years ago, and it still exists today. Obviously, these letters are just from a museum. But you start to see some decoration, very rudimentary, very simple decoration. We're gonna learn more about ceramics as we get into the Greek periods. But this is kind of during this period we start to see more development of ceramics. They existed before, but this is more widespread. So we have basically two districts that Egypt is divided into during this period. We have Heracleopolis. So Cairo's kind of fallen. It still exists, but there's no government there. So we have the district of Heracleopolis, and then we have the district of Thebes down in the south. A Theban nomarch, so he was just a nomarch. He gathered a bunch of people together. This is in 2125. He was called the Great Overlord. He had the backing of all of the temple priests or the mortuary priests behind him, and he basically, bless you, rose to more power and challenged the authority of these leaders way up here. And he started to basically get this revolution started that would eventually lead to Egypt being united again, and that's where we get into the kingdom of, or the Middle Kingdom. So, again, these dynasties, very short period, very quick. Down here we have this initial ruler, this initial nome, who Imhotep, who started this process. He wasn't successful. He wasn't able to conquer Heracleopolis or get it under his control. And again, these were not super bloody wars. They were more like internal skirmishes. But he was able to get the ball rolling, and that sets the stage for Amenhotep.
Were there pharaohs at this point, or had there ever been a pharaoh?
So there were pharaohs up at this point. Most of them were in Memphis. So the ones who built the pyramids and the Sphinx and all that stuff.
Okay.
So those exist, but because of the collapse of that era, there may have been a pharaoh. I don't know enough. I'm sorry. Maybe there were pharaohs during this time, but they were essentially regional rulers.
So were the pharaohs more in the Middle Kingdom or the Old Kingdom?
We have them all throughout. But during this intermediate period, there wasn't really a pharaoh who was taking control, or a series of pharaohs. There were these dynasties, but they weren't powerful. They were basically, think of let's say the United States collapsed and the president becomes the governor of like Washington D.C. That's kind of what was happening. And then over time, all right, so this is probably actually a good way of looking at it. The president, the United States kind of falls apart. There's a huge recession. He becomes the governor of, let's say, Virginia. So do we still have a president? Yeah, but he's pretty weak and his power is pretty much centralized. Then the governor of California becomes very popular, challenges his authority, and he has the majority of the backing of, let's say, the Navy behind him, and he becomes the president now, and the capital of the United States moves to Los Angeles. That's essentially what happens here. That's essentially what happens. The capital was in Memphis. These guys come up, they start to take over Heracleopolis, and now the capital is down in Thebes. So we have this kind of back and forth between these capitals, sometimes in Egypt. But that's essentially what's happening. It's where the power is. That's where the capital is.
What causes it to fall though, from being like such a great
Money.
kingdom?
Money.
Kingdom?
All the money and all the taxation that these huge building projects, the pyramids, the Sphinx, etc., all these temples that were built. We didn't look at a lot of temples, but temples were being built as well. It was a ton of spending that decimated the money of the rest of the population, and the kingdom basically collapsed. Okay. All right, so now we move into the Middle Kingdom. The first intermediate period ended when Mentuhotep II of Thebes defeated the kings of Heracleopolis. This is a depiction of Mentuhotep. He looks pretty much the same as all the other ones. Yep, super tan. Thebes now becomes the capital of Egypt, and now again we have a strong central government. So Thebes is now this strong central government. So all of these different artistic styles. So again, this is not just a history class. This is an art history class. So we have to focus on the art, right? Or we want to focus on the art. All of these different artistic styles that flourished during this very short period of time. This was allowed to continue, right? So you said someone asked if the Shabti statues continued. Yeah, they did, and all these different styles still continued.
So the way these pharaohs and like people in Egypt were depicted, is that actually how they looked?
Generally not. And we'll talk about stylization. We'll talk about stylization next class. We'll talk about that because that's super important for the Egyptians. But kind of working through one concept at a time. What he's wearing, this white crown, this was the crown of Lower Egypt. You'll often see a crown of Upper Egypt, which is a red crown. It has a little like red curly Q on the front. As pharaohs become more popular or more powerful, and they start to really unify Egypt, they're going to wear what's called the double crown. and it's white in the middle and red around the outside. You'll see some depictions of it. This is an early depiction of Mentuhotep, so he's just wearing the southern crown. Mentuhotep. Okay, so rulers of the Middle Kingdom, they were not as strict about the art. They encouraged the different styles of the districts. They didn't mandate that all art conform to the taste of the nobility. They still wanted to kind of bring everything back to the Old Kingdom style of art, and they did. But they still allowed the common people, the middle class, to practice art the way that they had been during this period. So we can say that the Middle Kingdom is really kind of the high point of Egyptian art. There was a lot being developed. It still maintained a lot of the traditions, but there was some innovation that was happening as well. This is a view today of the tomb of Mentuhotep II. And it really is a work of art. Not today, but back when it was built,
Did you not get a pyramid?
he sure did.
Holy.
So
Shit,
Yeah.
why not a freestanding pyramid? Why did Mentuhotep not want to have this grand, huge freestanding pyramid anymore? Money, maybe. Maybe different. That was the Old Kingdom, wanted to be different. Okay, maybe.
Something new.
And that looks way cooler.
That's like
It
with
shows his.
Where's it built?
In the mountains.
In Thebes.
Against a cliff.
In Thebes.
So it's a lot harder to break into because you've already got this natural stone, this natural rock. They were very concerned about grave robbers. Remember we talked about that, how if you steal the stuff that's around the pharaoh, he's going to have a really crappy afterlife. So as tombs progress, security for a tomb becomes more and more important to these pharaohs. This is what it looks like. He still wants to have the pyramid. He still wants to have that callback to the Old Kingdom. We've talked about this several times now, how a ruler always wants to reinforce his current rule with the importance of the previous rulers. So even though this is basically a kind of a mastaba in a way, he still wants to have that pyramid. It serves no function. It's just purely there to show his, the link, the relationship.
Did
Mm-hmm.
they ever because of the grave robbers? Did they ever bury other people with them as the guards?
Decoys?
Yeah.
I don't know. Other people may have been buried, but I don't know if they were there for that reason. I'm not sure.
Where is that children
Do
buried?
they have traps in them?
I'm sorry?
Do they have traps
Mm-mm.
inside pyramids?
Nope. That's
So
just
how did it get destroyed?
just time. Just time.
What about if the pharaoh
I
had
didn't
children?
see those.
Where were they buried?
So sometimes in outer chambers of the same tomb, sometimes in their own tombs, because if the pharaoh had children, they were usually pharaohs as well.
That's right.
Okay, so here's kind of a cross section. All right, so what is it that's important about this? So you can see this is the entrance, this is this pyramid, and then inside the rock face, right, here's the cliff. Down here is where the tomb is. So they've tunneled into the cliff. That whole front part is just a facade, and it's actually not a facade, it's a whole religious temple. It's a tomb and a temple. So this is the big...
Drilled into the rock just to bury him.
Mm-hmm.
How did they get in there?
Lots of chisels.
That's
All right, so there are 3 innovations of Mentuhotep's temple. You might want to,
In the middle. This is two.
maybe for his wife, I'm not sure. So 3 innovations that you're going to want to know here. So the one on the back. First is the earliest mortuary temple. So remember, it's not just a mortuary. It's not just a mausoleum. It's a temple as well. The king is not just the recipient of offerings. So he's not just the recipient of all the stuff that's around him. And hey, let's help the king get to the afterlife and let's give him all this stuff. But after his death, he is going to be basically the god of this temple, and he's going to perform ceremonies in this temple after his death for the other deities. Okay? And before his death, he will go in there as a priest. There was always this distinction between the pharaoh and the priest. The priests are the ones who perform the ceremonies, just like we have today, right? And then there's the pharaoh who's the ruler. Yes, the pharaoh is godlike, but he doesn't perform the ceremonies. But Mentuhotep is going to blur those lines a little bit, and he's going to go in and he's going to start to perform some ceremonies before he's dead as well in this temple. So again, this is a religious place with a burial attached to it.
But
the Egyptian priests have this like that, or do they just?
Yeah, there was going to be some tension between them because of that.
What's the other slope in there?
This one
Just like
leading to the Ka sanctuary. So this is where his Ka statues are. So this is where he buries his Ka statues.
Is there a rebirth for the
Okay. The second thing, the temple identifies the king with Osiris. Previously, pharaohs had never been identified with Osiris. It was other gods at the time. Some of them would be seen as identifying with Ra or other gods, but he's going to be identified with Osiris. Osiris was a god that was very popular in Thebes. He was kind of like the patron saint of Thebes. So he's going to be identifying with Osiris.
what did you mean? What is it meant by identified by Osiris?
So he's gonna say that he is the embodiment of Osiris. Other pharaohs are going to say they're the embodiment of this god. Okay? And then finally, most of the temple decoration is work of local Theban artists. So it's, again, very different from what we saw up north. Okay? This is not the coffin of Mentuhotep, but his coffin would have looked very similar to this. And there's also another innovation here that's happening where you start to see inside coffins a map of the underworld. So a map of the river that they have to cross and a map of the place where they have to go. I couldn't tell you what it means. It meant something to them. I don't know. But
Do they have like afterlife classes? Or like they would teach
the priest would have it. The priest kind of had this.
They say after this you need to go here.
Yeah. Yeah. Jewelry was also refined greatly at this time. We already saw some of those amulets during the intermediate period, and it's going to just continue during the Middle Kingdom. Here's a beautiful example of one. So this is a chain. This is part of the chain. We're just zoomed in to the amulet in the middle, and we see here depictions of God. We see depiction of Horus on the left and the right. The scarab beetle, right? That was very important to the Egyptians. So what is this? We have the Ankh symbols, right? So what is this? This is a term that's called cloisonné, which is a French term. We still use it when we talk about Egyptians, but basically it's enamel. What is enamel? Glass. Glass mixed with pigment, powdered glass mixed with pigment. You have a disc of gold. So in this case, it's a disc, and they leave these indentations in it. And then you take the powdered glass and the pigment, and you basically just sprinkle it in, and then you fire it again. You put it over the fire again. The glass melts, and it turns into enamel. So all of these different sections, these are all just little pockets of glass that's been melted. So this is a huge development that's happening during this time. So this jewelry, this metalwork just expands. We have a continuation of the work of common people. So middle class art. Common people are starting to be depicted for the first time in art. Again, because there's this market for it. People want to see depictions of themselves. The pharaoh wouldn't have this made, but maybe people want to buy this in the market, right? This is a game. So similar to like backgammon. I don't know how it's played, but you have a little drawer in there for your pieces, and then you move those little stakes around in the holes. Okay. And then jewelry being made for common people as well.
So like, how would they get the beads?
Polished stone.
What kind of stone is that? Do you
To grind it.
I don't know. Amethyst, maybe?
It looks like amethyst.
That's pretty good.
I mean, it's heavier.
What's that?
Are those like sharp?
No,
Oh,
that's
they're lion teeth.
No line
Lion
claws.
claws. Oh.
Yeah, it's-
cat's claw looks like.
yeah, but they're made out of gold or copper maybe or something. Another innovation of this time is what's called block statues. These would continue to be popular for the next 2,000 years. So this is an innovation that started in the Middle Kingdom and then continued. A block statue is basically, it's a depiction of a man squatting with his knees drawn up to his chest and his arms folded on top of his knees. They're almost seen as like tomb guardians, and they would often be placed next to tombs, even of middle class and not lower class, but middle class people. And there would be some sort of incantations or spells. So these wouldn't be for every middle class person. This is like priests or kind of upper class people. Why this block statue? Well, it looks imposing, but also there's a practical reason. A lot easier to carve this than someone standing straight up. It takes a lot less skill. And in fact, yeah.
Sorry, I think I'm just kind of confused as to like how you say like they give them to upper class people because didn't they believe like everyone went into the afterlife? So why
Yeah.
don't they give the same kind of respect to lower class people?
Because simply can't afford it. It's the same thing as someone who's lower class not being able to have a very nice coffin.
Oh, okay.
So you just can't afford
So
it.
they don't think these things are really necessary. That's what because I'm. If
It just helps you.
It just helps you. Okay, I thought they were
Yep.
like, necessary.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like if you're very rich and you have a relative who passes away and you want to give something to the church, like a stained glass window or something, in memory of my mother. Well, it doesn't mean that this person's going to get to heaven any faster or less than this person. That's what rich people do, right? Okay. They were often very simple, right? So the idea was this guy is sitting there and he has this cloak over him, but it makes it very easy to carve these. And so middle class people could afford these. It didn't cost a lot of money to make these, and it didn't take a lot of skill to make them either. So you'll often see these block statues with some sort of a incantation or a spell or something on them. You would often sometimes see a depiction of a god right there in the middle as well. And again, this is just to help protect the tomb and protect the person for the afterlife. During the Middle Kingdom, we also see something that we hadn't seen before, which is depictions of women. If you think back, other than the Pharaoh's wife on some wall carvings and maybe some tombs, you generally don't see depictions of women. But now we have women patrons. Culture back in Egypt was actually fairly progressive in terms of equality between women and men, especially during the Middle Kingdom, and especially because of the success of the middle classes and these people during this intermediate period. So you have women shop owners. You have women who are very powerful in certain aspects of society. Never priests, never rulers up till this point, but very prominent, very powerful, pretty similar to what we would see today. And so women would want to commission statues.
Would women work with the priests in the temple though? Like would they kind of like I guess like what you call like altar boys nowadays? Like that.
I don't know.
They were?
I don't know enough about their religious practices. I'm not sure. So what can we learn about these statues? Well, we can kind of see what the standards of beauty were for the Egyptians. The hair, excuse me, the hair during this period is always parted in the middle. It's always pulled strongly to the sides, and it's always put behind the ears. The ears are always sticking forward a little bit. In all of the statues, this must have been a thing. I don't know. Looking straight ahead, the arms are very stiff, the body is very stiff. Those are the proportions of the chest and the head and everything that was desirable for the Egyptians at the time. But you see these very sculpted eyebrows. They were plucking back then. Big ears, hair to the side. And you look at almost all of them during this period, they're all very similar to this. So this was a cheaper one. This was made out of wood. And it's not big. It's probably 7 to 8 inches tall, right? So a middle class person could afford this, or maybe they did it themselves.
Do we still have the wood ones?
Right there.
Okay.
Yep. Because the Egyptian climate was so dry, a lot of the wood doesn't rot. Here's another wood one. We see traces of paint, so a lot of these were painted as well, and painted very well.
So is that their actual hair or is it like a wig? Because sometimes they can get
So yeah, they wouldn't be able to afford a wig. This class people wouldn't be able to afford a
No,
wig.
I'm saying like for Egyptians, like do the women wear like wigs? Or were they-
Not the middle class people. The higher class people would.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right, so what happens to the Middle Kingdom? It collapses. Just like every kingdom throughout history, it collapses at some point. What do we have? We have the Nubians from the south. They start to come in, and they conquer this area. We also have the Hyksos. Right, Hyksos, these are people, they didn't actually come in this way. That was only Moses. They come in down here, this way, and they come and they conquer Thebes. So there's this second intermediate period that we'll look at briefly. There wasn't a lot of development in the second intermediate period. We're just going to look at it briefly when we look at have class next Thursday, and then we'll get into the New Kingdom. Okay? Am I missing anything? Nubians encroached from the south, the Hyksos, substantial foothold in the Delta region.
What was the pictorial of Somerset?
That was that really pretty necklace that we saw. The really, with the gold in the enamel, that one. It's called a pectoral because it goes right here on your pectoral muscles.
So who was it for again?
This was for a pharaoh. This was jewelry for the pharaoh. Yes, he gave to his daughter. Thin gold wires attached to a solid gold backing, inlaid with 372 semi-precious stones, and also enamel.
372.
Yep.
So that's just an advanced culture. It's so weird to think
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
So many, like,
Very, very good.
wow. It's like so far ago. What happened to it? Why would it
Greece and Rome. They got much more advanced, really fast. Any questions? We have, don't forget, research paper outline is coming up soonish,
Wait, so no
22nd.
No logic tomorrow?
No logic tomorrow because we have a test.
But like no logic on the text.
Correct.
Wait, no logic on the text.
No logic on the
For an
test?
outline, do you want it just like first paragraph, 3 bullet points, second paragraph, 3 bullet points?
Yeah, let's talk more about it a little bit. But basically,
Wait, no logic.
chat with some of the seniors about how I want to do it. But basically, I want your thesis statement. So on your outline, I want your thesis statement for your paper, what it is that we're going to be studying, what it is that you're going to be looking at, and then go through, all right, then outline bullet points. Okay. 22nd. So you got time. It'll be 19th. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what. The outline or the paper? 3 to 5 pages. It's a big one.